The MEM is a safe space where we get to know each other's stories and therefore became part of them. Encounters helped us break the wall of fear of the unknown and made us embrace our differences, as well as the sense of belonging to a region with common history, but most of all, common future.
It's fascinating how oppression sometimes and limitation, people express themselves in artistic forms.
I come from a region that is characterized by many social, political, and economic failures. However, I believe that today we have at our disposal multiple tools that allow us to come together and find solutions that we can all benefit.
Il n'y a pas d'espace en fait comme le même finalement pour se rencontrer, d'où qu'on vienne, qui qu'on soit et quelles que soient ses aspirations pour le futur.
Je crois en une capacité à rassembler l'énergie de nos jeunes pour essayer quelque chose d'inné, encore un jour.
The MEM Summit is a unique opportunity to connect with different people from the Mediterranean region and across this part of the world.
Communication happens if and only if an act of expression needs an act of listening, of understanding. And this is exactly what has happened in the last 2 weeks here.
This is all part of our promotion of peace and stability in the interest of the MENA region, but also of Europe, and therefore of Switzerland.
The seminar of the MEM Summer Summit is devoted to us.
The young change makers, to the innovators, the dreamers, for the ones who are ready to work hard, to focus on what unites us,
not what divides us.
In a safe space, to debate, to exchange ideas,
to learn,
To raise a challenging question.
Ladies and gentlemen, Diana Segantini e Younes Daghiambadi.
Buongiorno, good morning, bonjour, sabah al-khair. Lisa Bakir, but still early for Saturday morning, but I'm very, very happy to have such a wonderful group in this auditorium here today. We had an amazing kickstart yesterday with welcome addresses of the authorities of Lugano, of the canton, and of course a confederation with the federal councillor Cassis, who's a native from Lugano and a great supporter of MEM Summit since the beginning. So I'm very happy not to be standing alone up here today, so I do welcome Younes Daghiambadi, and he's an alumni of the Young Changemakers, but he's also the Deputy Director of the Institute for Peace and Diplomacy in Canada and the US. Very warm welcome. I'm happy we're going to do this together today.
Thank you very much, Diana, for the kind introduction, but also I'm excited and honored to be sharing the stage with you as the co-MC of the forum, which I believe that it could not be any more timely with, considering what's been happening in the region since last year, and now with the return of President Trump to the White House, which itself promises even more drastic and transformative changes, not only to the region, but also beyond. And for that, we have an amazing group of speakers joining us to not only discuss this, but also other topics across the region. And with that, I'd like to hand it over to you, Diana, for the introduction of the first panel.
Thank you so much. As you know, the theme of not only the summit, but also the seminar that has been going on all week here in Lugano behind closed doors with the young changemaker is dialogue, and how dialogue is so important. So today, especially also in the panels, we'll give the floor also and especially to the young changemakers, because this is all about the idea of this happening here in Lugano. So I will start with introducing the first panel. The theme is Evolving Geopolitical Configurations in the MEM Region. What lies ahead? And this panel is in collaboration with the Graduate Institute of Geneva. So thank you so much, and thanks for introducing the panelists.
Thank you. So from the United Kingdom, we're honored to have with us Roxane Farmanfarmaian, who serves as the academic director at the Institute of Continuing Education of the University of Cambridge. Roxane, please join us on the stage.
Then we welcome Gal Cohen, young changemaker. Please join us on the scene. Please.
And from the United States, we're honored to have with us Scott Nelson, Associate Professor of Political Science at Virginia Tech. Please join us on the stage.
Then we have another changemaker, Abdelkarim Skour. أهلا وسهلا. تفضل.
Last but not least, we're honored to have with us again one of the best journalists known not only in Switzerland but also internationally, Emiliano. Please. Thank you, Emiliano.
And he will moderate.
Yeah, and then he will definitely be the moderator for this session. Thank you.
Have a great first panel.
Buongiorno, good morning. Bonjour, sabah al-khair. So I did like Diana, and it's okay already. Thank you so much. I have the honor to host you. We have such a challenge ahead of us because evolving geopolitical configurations is such a huge task. But we will try, if not to predict what's going to happen in a region that produces more news than history, we will at least try to see what we can read to what's happening now and try to understand what lies actually ahead. So as usual, we will have a conversation here and a Q&A after, so please take your time after. We will have 10-15 minutes at the end and to listen from you, and it's very important also to dialogue. And I'm happy that we have two experts and two young changemakers. So Professor Farmanfarmaian, I would start from you. As I said, we do not pretend to see what's going to happen, to try to understand it, but it's happening a lot right in front of us. The day of the US elections, the Ministry of Defense of Israel was fired, and the situation in Gaza, we know after more than 11 months, we know what's happening in Lebanon, and Iran is one of the key actors in the region. I happened to be in Jerusalem October the 1st when missiles were crossing the sky in Jerusalem, and it's something that you remember forever. It happened in April as well. Hopefully it won't happen again, but we are looking every day in order to understand what's happening in the region. So Ken, with you, and you are the Director of International Studies and Global Politics at University of Cambridge Institute for Continuing Education, so you work daily on the Middle East politics and what's happening there. Can you help us in understanding how Iran, where a new administration started his job a few months ago, how this country is and could be and will be at the center of this geopolitical stage in the region?
Thank you very much.
No, it should be on.
Can you hear me? Okay, fantastic. Thank you very much. And thank you for inviting me to be part of this wonderful opportunity to discuss a very complex region. Thank you, Federica, for inviting me, and also for Eunice for thinking of me for this. I think that President Trump, since that is the newest big piece of news that we have, is facing a very different Middle East than he did when he came in 2016. The Maghreb states today have emerged from the Arab Spring of 2011. The civil wars in Syria and Libya have settled into grinding forever wars, as far as we can tell. The Gulf states, the rich states of the GCC, have emerged and retrenched after the Arab Spring. And of course, the Gaza war has erupted, according to Hamas, partially because of the Abraham Accords that sidelined the Palestinian issue. So to discuss the evolution of this current configuration and where Iran fits into it, we could go back to the establishment of Israel in 1948, or we could go to the 67 war, or we could look at the establishment of Hamas in 1987 at the time of the First Intifada, or the Oslo Accords in 1993, or even to Israeli Prime Minister Sharon's decision in 2005 to withdraw Israeli settlers from Gaza and establish the Strip as a Palestinian enclave. As you say, there's a lot of history as well as constant news. But let's instead go back to the period immediately before the outbreak of the Gaza war, when the Abraham Accords appeared to set the tone for the Arab-Israeli relations, and the US, in providing security guarantees, was then able to begin its pivot to look towards China. In 2022, however, a surprise China-led rapprochement between Iran and Saudi Arabia changed the goalposts of the Gulf, probably in ways much greater than have been understood abroad. The deal was struck because Saudi Arabia was asked by Iran to please rein in its anti-Iranian media that had really ballooned during the times of the protests of the Women's Life Freedom. And the Iranians were asked by the Saudis to rein in their axis of resistance militias and stop attacking particularly Gulf states. The result was that the Gulf and Iran together developed a new neighborhood agenda, emphasizing compartmentalization of differences, of focusing on repairing relations and engaging in mutual projects. And this did not mean, I hasten to say, that they really trusted each other a great deal more. However, they strengthened ties and communicated more effectively, and developed a much more important perspective of their neighborhood as a political and security area that they shared. When Gaza erupted, Iran's foreign minister, who has since died due to a helicopter crash, he immediately engaged in something quite new, a shuttle diplomacy around the region, promoting a common Muslim message towards Gaza. And at the same time, the focus of Iran's axis of resistance, which had very much been on trying to evict the United States from the region, shifted and focused primarily on Israel. So what happened next? The Houthis began to attack ships headed for Israel in the Gulf. And in response, the US and the Europeans developed a multinational shipping force to counter the Houthi effort. However, the Gulf states did not join this effort. And this is a reflection of this shift in the region, of their concern to retain peaceful relations among themselves that would guarantee their own territorial security in the face of sudden regional volatility. This has been a growing trajectory. Recently, Iran and Egypt have started trying to reestablish relations for the first time in well over a couple of decades. And Saudi has become increasingly vocal, despite what we know its leader, Mohammed bin Salman, MBS, his personal ideas do not actually get reflected in the rhetoric that is coming out of Saudi. Saudi is stating it needs to have a two-state solution for the Palestinians before any Abraham Accords-like arrangement can be struck between Riyadh and Jerusalem. As the Gaza war has unfolded, followed by the Israeli attack on Lebanon and Hezbollah, with significant assassinations targeting Iranian military leaders and allies, Iran has become more tightly embroiled in the war. 2 rounds of rocket attacks on Israel, however, tested this growing relationship with its neighbors in the Gulf. And these Gulf neighbors faced a very difficult challenge in that they needed to balance their own desire to stay neutral while nonetheless having to deal with the pressure that was coming down on them from the United States to open up their airspace to Israeli retaliation. Throughout, however, we've seen Iran's disinclination to see the war in Gaza escalate, to a war between Tehran and Jerusalem, and by association, the US. And this is a position, interestingly, paralleled by the Biden administration. How this will change now that Trump will be taking his position in the White House is unclear. On the one hand, he's told Netanyahu, wrap this up. I don't like wars. I want to be seen to end wars. I want to get a Nobel Prize for ending wars. On the other hand, this may be an opportunity for him to attack Iran's nuclear facilities, something we know that his hardline envoys and officials such as Brian Hook, who is likely to come back into the administration, would very much like to do. On the other hand, since Trump is so very volatile and we don't know, he may find this an opportunity to negotiate a new deal. The Arab states in the Gulf clearly themselves also don't want to see an escalation. Turkey doesn't either, and it's a member of NATO. And so what we see is that they are having to take into consideration the feelings of their populations. We always think of them as authoritarian and very monarchical, but these days they have got to take into consideration that their peoples are in the streets demanding that they cut relations with Israel, that Israel is conducting a genocide, and they do not want to see any kind of support coming out of the Arab states for Israeli actions. The Abraham Accords themselves are on rocky ground. Bahrain, the only signatory that has broken relations with Israel, however, is backed up by the other Abraham Accords signatories in that relations with commercially with Israel have been downgraded, and all have made it clear that until there is a two-state solution that is actively being instrumentalized, the Abraham Accords will not be able to get back on track. And I would see that this is real opportunity for Europe to get involved in negotiations. They have had a backseat position ever since the Arab Spring, actually, trying to find how to find a role in the Middle East. And here I think there is real room to negotiate common benefits and reduce common risks in the prioritization of the Palestinian state as part of a reinstatement of the Abraham Accords. So I'd like to wrap up by focusing specifically on where Iran is. Timing, of course, is always one of the interesting elements of international relations. And just as the Gaza war was unfolding was when this helicopter crash took place and the leader, very hardline leader of Iran, Ebrahim Raisi, died and was replaced in an election by a much more reformist, moderate-oriented leader, Pezeshkian, who campaigned on a platform to restart negotiations with the United States in order to reduce sanctions on Iran. And he has a character that actually, as a politician, he has shown he's willing to bargain and discuss, and that he has really pushed that Iran show behavior that does not alienate the United States, so that a possibility of further negotiations on a new deal might take place. And so, although it's certainly not improving its internal human rights record at the moment, we do see from a foreign perspective that Iran is trying to show it is a pragmatic and reliable member of the Gulf, and that it wants to reduce the toxicity which remains very active between it and the United States, and instead renegotiate its nuclear program deal. Now, the deal itself has to be started from scratch. The old one, most of its tenets have now expired, and I think this, again, is an opportunity for Europe to get back involved and probably very much link a new deal to a new Trump administration. It's one of the big stumbling blocks, the actions of its militias in the region, its axis of resistance, now we know are very much more focused on the war. They're weaker, and Iran itself is in a very different position as Trump takes the helm at the White House. And so I think there are regional ideas that can be brought in. The Gulf itself, it used to be very against the original deal, primarily because it felt it had been sidelined. It had not been brought in to the negotiations. This is an opportunity, second time around, for the Gulf to be part of this. In fact, some discussion was already taking place at the time of the Gaza war eruption. So they need to be part of the negotiations. The Europeans especially the Southern Europeans, I think, are in an ideal position to bring them in. And so I think that we can see a new Iran nuclear deal take shape with a lot more actors now part of this, moving towards a peaceful negotiation rather than a nuclear arms race in the Gulf, which is one of the darker pictures that are often being brought up. Of course, there is possibly a darker picture. We have Lebanon, which is falling apart in many ways. The only European leader to have gotten engaged with that is Emmanuel Macron, and so far not with much benefit to France. And we see that the hardline American position could indeed lead to a greater level of conflict in the Gaza region. But we're going to keep our fingers crossed and hope instead that this is an opportunity for further diplomacy. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Well, you put so many topics on the table, and we went through the map of this region, and among the many things you mentioned, when you were talking about Turkey, you say they have to listen to people in the street. Been to Israel many times in the last months, and I've been there on Saturday night when families of hostages are crying, begging their own government in order to strike a deal. Of course, you need a counterpart, you need Hamas on the other side, but I was really shocked, and we were reporting about that, about how Israeli society, at least a part of it, is really asking Netanyahu government to find a solution. And I saw hostage families beaten by the police, and it's something that is you cannot forget about that. And so there is also another place in the region that people needs to be listened from their own government. And so I'm thinking about Israel. So I go to Gail Cohen. He's from Israel, and is a country that at the very moment is, it's always been at the center of the stage in the region, but right now, can you give us your personal feeling, your impression, how this government is representing the society after the huge trauma that probably we did not realize completely of what's happened October the 7th. Of course, we know what's happened, but probably here from the other side of the Mediterranean, we are not still fully understanding what it meant for Israeli society, but also the reaction, the extreme reaction, I would say, and I mean what I say, the extreme reaction of Israel towards Gaza. And how does this government represent the society, or how do you feel about that?
Thank you, Emiliano. Working? Can you hear me? Yeah. Thank you, Emiliano, for your question. I would like to start by thanking the MEM team and the participants for giving me this incredible opportunity to participate in the summit in such difficult times. And I don't think it's trivial, the fact that we were able to talk and really conduct meaningful conversations and dialogues around these very difficult issues. I would also like to say that I'm making these statements in my private capacity, and that I'm not an expert in Israeli politics. While I consider myself a highly informed Israeli citizen, I'm not an expert in Israeli or global politics. About this government, so the short answer would be, I do not think that this government represents the Israeli public, and that I believe that this government, because of its precarious position, is also highly in a state of a conflict of interests regarding the conduct of the Israeli foreign policy and the way that Israel responded to the 7th of October massacre. It is almost 2 years since this government came to power. They came to power in January 2023. And it's exactly 2 years since they actually won the elections. I went to Israel. I live in London. I went to Israel especially to vote exactly 2 years ago, and it's also the same time. So you were talking about the historical context. It's about the same time as the anniversary of the assassination of an Israeli prime minister named Yitzhak Rabin, who was responsible for the peace process with Jordan and for the Oslo Accords. So this period of the year is very important for the balance of power in Israeli politics, but also for the rise of power of the current government. And the current government rose to power with a campaign focusing on security, also building on the fact that the government that came before it was the first government that in which Arab parties, an Arab party sat in the coalition for the first time in Israeli history. And they were very much building their campaign on it, saying that the previous government has betrayed its voters and that Arab parties cannot sit in the coalition. They won a very precarious majority. In Israel, you need to have at least 61. You have 120 seats in parliament. You need to have at least 61 seats in order to have a majority and a coalition to form a functioning government. They got 64 in an unfortunate coincidence, if you ask me, because some parties on the left were not able to unite, and therefore they did not pass the threshold, which is 4 seats. 2 parties that are associated with the Israeli left, Meretz and Balad, which is an Arab party, did not pass that threshold, and therefore the right got a more substantial majority in the current coalition, and they have a more stable majority than they would have had otherwise. What followed their rise to power was not concerned with security at all. Maybe they would try to connect it somehow, but they were trying to enact judicial reforms that would curtail the power of the Israeli Supreme Court and grant that power essentially to the government, weakening the checks and balances that exist in the Israeli constitutional system. And they faced a very strong opposition from not only, I would say, from the Israeli left, but a lot of also liberal rights that were concerned of what will happen to Israeli democracy if these judicial reforms would be enacted. Eventually, they managed to legislate one law that was invalidated by the court, but until the 6th of October, they were still largely into these judicial reforms. And then the 7th of October happened, the judicial reforms were officially abandoned, but sometimes they're still mentioned as something that this coalition would like to do. I think when we talk about these judicial reforms, it's also important to note that Netanyahu, who is the leader of this coalition, is facing criminal charges. And it is connecting me to my next topic of why this government, I feel, is really in a strong position of a conflict of interest. So, as I said before, they were running on security, and then they went to judicial reforms while its leader is facing criminal charges, which is highly dubious. And then the largest failure in largest security failure in Israeli history occurred, and there was, of course, a lot of criticism in the immediate aftermath of the 7th of October. You were running on security. For a year, you haven't been doing anything for Israeli security, and then this happens. And so they wanted to show strength. That's the first thing. The second thing is that there were a lot of calls for the immediate resign, but they were saying you do not change a government while a war is ongoing. And also there were calls for an investigation of the failures that happened. But again, they said, you do not investigate a war while the war is ongoing. And so they're in this very precarious position, especially Netanyahu, who is facing the charges, that they have an interest in actually extending the war because they don't want people to call for a change of government, they don't want people to call for an investigation. And also, because of the structure of the current coalition, whenever there are talks of ceasefire, the ultra-right party in that coalition, whose name is the Religious Zionists, immediately tell Netanyahu, if you go for this deal, the government will be toppled. And Netanyahu, thinking about his chair as always, does not want this to happen. So I think, again, to summarize, my opinion is that this government does not represent the Israeli public. There were protests since this government came to power, first about the judicial reforms, now for ending the war and the return of the hostages. And they're in a position of conflict of interest that really puts into doubt their ability to manage the Israeli conduct regarding the war.
Thank you so much. We don't have to forget that they were elected, so that's the government, and we don't know what's going to happen with Trump. We know there is a U.S. embassy in Jerusalem. I have just next to it, and it's written Donald Trump, Mike Pence, Mike Pompeo. 2018, Trump did recognize Jerusalem as capital of Israel. Of course, something that it's also symbolic. And by the way, I don't know if you know that Netanyahu named after Trump the Trump Heights in the occupied Golan, also because the U.S. recognized the occupied Golan. So there is a village called Trump Heights now, and probably they're happy that the president is back in his position in the White House, so they know while they are living in the Trump Heights. But we don't know what lies ahead, and we will keep an eye, and also because it's going to be very interesting to understand which will be the relations between Israel and the US with the new administration. But I go back to the new opportunities which Professor Farmanfarmaian was mentioning in order to give the floor to Professor Scott Nelson, Associate Professor of Political Science at Virginia Tech. He knows very well the region because there is in Riva San Vitale, not far from Mendrisio, 15 minutes driving from here, there is a location that Virginia Tech has been using often in the years, bringing US and international students here in Ticino. So he's kind of familiar with the region, and he's a half a semester or half a year, academic year here in home here. So Professor Scott Nelson, welcome to you as well. We go to the new opportunities because we understood it's a very tense situation, but as Professor Farmanfarmaian was mentioning, something might open up new opportunities, nuclear deal, but also on the economic side, on new sets of relations, and also we will touch with Abdelkarim Skour these new opportunities. But you authored recently a book, Statecrafts and Political Economy of Capitalism. So if we look at something beyond the wars and the tensions, is there any good news that you can give us, meaning that amid this situation, can you foresee something that might be a positive evolution or a kind of a new configurations that can bring some hope and some positive change in the region?
The answer is yes. Is there time for questions? So thank you, Emiliano. I want to thank the organizers, and you're being subjected to me twice, not just once, and I apologize for that, but maybe I can bring some things into sharper focus in just a few minutes. So I want to start with a story which my Swiss colleagues tell me about an experience that Swiss children have in the schools here in this remarkable country. And I don't know if this is true or not, but even if it isn't, it demonstrates something I think deep and fundamental related to to Emiliano's questions. So Swiss children, as I understand it, from a very young age, are presented with a map of Switzerland in the context of Europe. And they're asked to comment on the geographical advantages that Switzerland enjoys with its unique geography. And the students are puzzled and they're looking at this remarkable situation of a small country that's landlocked. And there's a great power to the north, and there's a great power to the west, and there's a great power to the south, and there's oftentimes trouble to the east. And there isn't much arable land in Switzerland. And there are these crazy mountains that are just distributed in ways that don't make sense over the whole geography of this landscape. Much of it is beautiful, but there are real limitations here. And the students are induced to understand that we don't have geographical advantages. We've only got disadvantages. And so that induces in students this realization that all we have is up here. All we have is our minds, and we have to invest in education, broadly defined, in order to advantage us, in order to position us relative to these enormous constraints that we face. And so I, like Roxane and my fellow panelists, want to resist the temptation to look at these screaming headlines that come at us at light speed, and we're all consumed with these, and they have their place, and it's important to keep up with the news. But let's think historically, let's think geopolitically, and my remarks are going to be oriented around doing that. And there's a lot of darkness ahead, but there's also light. There are crises, and you know them well, just as I know them, but there are opportunities that emerge or derive from these crises. So let's think a little bit more carefully about those, and let's develop skills to respond to these crises and take advantage of the opportunities. It's not all doom and gloom. So nations have hit the globalization pause button, and they've been doing this for the past, let's say, 12 to 15 years. And yet we haven't seen world war. So that's quite different from the experiences that nations had in the 1920s. When we saw beggar thy neighbor policies, we saw the culmination of the first great era of globalization between 1870 and 1914, and we saw that order break down, and then it was an enormous task to reconstitute it, but nations were not predisposed to want to work together in the 1920s, and we all know the story, the awful culmination of that story in the 1930s and, of course, the 1940s. But we haven't seen that yet. And I think that's significant because we've built up institutions in the West that are, to be crass, keeping us from one another's throats. And these institutions are deep and fundamental, and they are critical in ways that we are not really immediately able to see when we fixate certainly on the headlines. But if we look historically and we think geopolitically, I think we have a much better grasp of the meaning of friendships and alliances. Friendships among nations which are not opportunistic, but deep, fundamental friendships and alliances among countries that do not share all the same interests, but there's significant overlap, and you have skilled diplomats and you have intelligent people that are willing to build upon those areas of overlap to prioritize very significant interests and to develop those capacities. I wish the Iran nuclear deal had not been thrown out by Trump, and he never gave us his reasons. But I think that we know what those reasons are, and I'm happy to hear an optimistic assessment that suggests that a new deal might be coming about, and I look forward to seeing how that develops. I share Roxane's much more optimistic assessment of some real areas of progress that we're seeing in the Middle East, in the MENA region, and also thanks to very skilled diplomacy that is happening in countries like Switzerland, in Europe more broadly. Anyway, back to globalization, if I may, just for a few more minutes, and then I'll conclude. And let me just say that in nations hitting this globalization pause button, what they're doing is that they are home-shoring production, they are near-shoring production, and they are friend-shoring production. And these commodity chains that have developed over the course of the post-war period reach deep into countries, reach deep into the economies of the countries that you know, and those commodity chains with these deep reaches into these economies will be very difficult to uproot, to unearth, and to rebuild elsewhere. And that's encouraging. And the institutions that we've built in Brussels and elsewhere relative to the recognition that these economic connections among countries are important and they should be preserved are vital. But also vital is a recognition that governments need to do a better job of understanding the vulnerabilities that come with open markets. My own country has not done this well enough, and on Tuesday we saw some of the results. So governments need to be much more skillful at developing shock absorbers, developing mitigating strategies in order to help to mitigate some of the bads that come along with many of the goods of open and integrating markets. That's one lesson. That story is yet to be written because it's still developing, and in the fullness of time, we'll see what happens. But I think there's a recognition that we had failed in terms of governance, domestically and in some respects internationally, and there's a recognition in Geneva at the World Trade Organization that this has to be addressed, and nations have to try to do a better job. Let me conclude with a brief mention of some sectors of the economies that are relevant to the MENA region that I think we need to be more alert to. And those are capital markets, those are markets in rare earths or rare earth minerals, and those are markets in natural gas. So the energy markets are forecasting that it's going to be natural gas as far as the eye can see as we're developing skills to transition away from dirty fossil fuels to a sustainable economy. So these are sectors of the global economy that we need to be more alert to, especially relative to the transition that is underway after Russia's reinvasion of Ukraine in 2022, and as Europe and the United States together become much more skeptical about what China has in store for the global economy. That doesn't mean turning our back on China, and it may not even mean turning our back on Russia. So Russia and China are not going away. So we need to find better means to share the earth with China and Russia. And I, like you, want to see more liberal regimes in these countries. I'm doubtful that that's going to happen anytime soon, but maybe that gives us a starting point for beginning dialogue. A dialogue which grants primacy to diplomacy, but is backstopped by power. That's when diplomacy is most effective, when it is backstopped by power. Finally, I want to come back to a theme that has surfaced here and there at the MEM Summit, and Roxane mentioned it a moment ago, which is the Arab Spring. What are some missed opportunities? That story, I think, also has yet to be written. But I would just remind folks that, and remind myself, that revolutions are really tricky. And we know this because we're good at history, or the Europeans are good at history. My own country, I'm not so sure, but the Europeans are really good at history. And we've studied the Russian Revolution, and we know that the shards of the Tsarist regime were used to rebuild the regime that would follow, that created such awful dynamics in Europe that you all know about. And so I would welcome insights on this, for some, a taboo topic in the MENA region, but I think the one that needs to be more front and center. In love and in politics, timing is everything, so there's a time for that, and let's get ahead of this and try to think about ways in which we can engage these conversations when the time is propitious. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Scott Nelson, and you open up our perspective from the MENA region to the rest of the world, to the connections actually with this region, with big powers. You mentioned Russia, of course China, and I go back to one of the last points you just mentioned about energy, new opportunity, new perspective, and so I can give the floor to Abdelkarim Skour. He's from Morocco. He has been working also in Algeria and Libya. We were chatting last night, so we want to also have a look at those countries, the southern shores of the Mediterranean Sea, to see how the geopolitical situation. Of course, we are mentioning the war in Israel because it's kind of setting the agenda and the relations in the region. Definitely also new perspective and new opportunity, as Professor Nelson was mentioning. From your point of view, how this, let's say, the Gaza impact is shaping new, because it's challenging the identity in itself of many Arab countries, and how is it impacting, and what we can see out of it.
Can you hear me? Yes. Thank you, Emilio, and once again, thanks to the MEM Summit for this opportunity to meet with peers and experts. It's an incredible experience, and it was very eye-opening in many ways. Can you hear me now better? Yes. I think it's important that I would take a step back before going ahead to my point, because my co-panelists made it difficult. I mean, they have all amazing insights on the topic. I go back to the Abraham Accords again. This, for instance, were accords that emerged in a context in which countries from the region were getting aware that there is need for a positive agenda, one which focuses on cooperation, try to bypass some difficult questions. It backfired in the end. But still, this need to look for a positive agenda, because they were getting aware more and more that we are entering a world which is nodal, which is multipolar, in which foreign policies are trying to embrace multi-alignment, to work with different partners. I mean, as Professor said, we cannot ignore the Chinese, we cannot ignore the Russians. We have to work together at some point and find the most working mechanism in a way. So this was the context, in my opinion, that led, the broad context that led to this. Again, sidelining Palestinians, among other things, was one of the failures of the Abraham Accords, and it backfired in the end. So this was the context that I came from. The Gaza war, of course, has challenged all these frameworks of cooperation. It put the West, in particular, Europe as well, into a difficult position. this human rights discourse, the democracy promotion frameworks have all been questioned to their core. And we have seen, I mean, if you read reports and surveys from the Arab world, you can see how much contestations there is among these populations, among these people, of the double standards of the West and the hypocrisy, the complacency, all these things. So I think this sets the frame for rethinking new frameworks of cooperation, and ones which are just and which are inclusive. That's very important to take into account. And we should also be aware that in its time of crisis that we have norms enterprise. We will see new norm entrepreneurs trying to build on this interregnum, try to influence as much as they can the setting and how the cooperation frameworks will be shaped. I'm thinking, for instance, speaking of Mediterranean affairs and speaking of Morocco, Algeria, Libya, among others, how the Chinese have been putting a lot of effort in the past years in the region by acquisition of very critical infrastructure, from ports to railways, for instance. And how, as Professor said earlier, the Europeans have been kind of in the back seat. They were not as active or as proactive as Mediterranean partners would have expected. And I think it's time, it's a wake-up call to look into these things with a new eye and with a fresh eye as well, and think about how to work towards a positive agenda, which is inclusive. We've seen a few developments. Maybe that's also a way to project ourselves into the future and how to use these developments. I'm seeing a new geopolitical commission in Brussels. There is a new portfolio, a commissioner for the Mediterranean. Let's see how this commissioner will think about these frameworks. Just before the Gaza war, there was also these talks about the IMEC creating economic corridors which are connecting different partners of Europe. Well, this is also something to be rethinking. But again, it's very important to make all these frameworks as inclusive as possible. You cannot go further if some partners are excluded. And one of these partners are in themselves, I mean, what challenged these frameworks from the start, which is the Palestinians and thinking about statehood. And I'm very happy that we heard yesterday about how, for instance, the Swiss diplomacy is being active as much as they can in for instance, fostering and promoting and pushing towards two-state solution and being engaged in the global alliance for the two-state solution. So these things are really very interconnected, and it's a complex world we live in. So that's my point.
Thank you. Thank you so much. I know we're running out of time, but if there's somebody with some questions, please, there's a micro there. We don't have a lot of time, but we would be happy to take one question. Yesterday we heard from, one second, let's give the floor to the question as well. Swiss Prime Minister talking about two-state solution, but if we look at the map, and there's no territorial continuity, so it looks like an utopia at the very moment because of 200 settlement and outposts there. So it's interesting, but we also have to keep in mind the reality on the ground. But that's my personal take about that, because it's the only solution, it's the only way forward. But honestly, what's happening while we're sitting here on the ground, it's telling us of a total different perspective on some other side. So if there's any question, please. If not, before wrapping up, I go back, Professor Farmanfarmaian, to you, just to kind of a closing statement, if we can, try to summarize and sum up what's been said up to now. New perspective, new opportunities, geopolitically, economically, inclusive frameworks you mentioned. Can we be somehow a little bit more optimistic? Because we started out with a description of the region, which honestly does not give any optimism at all, and uncertainty, and we don't know what's going to happen in terms of relations with the new Trump administration. Is there anything that can be instead being kind of a positive perspective?
Well, I think probably, can you hear me? one of the things that I would say is, will maybe not be more positive, but it will add to the complexity. And that is that I think it's clear that the Gaza war, but also the Ukraine war, which we have not mentioned, has contributed to a rapprochement between Iran and Russia. And I think we're seeing that that is somehow turning into one of the nodes added to by China that is creating a balance to what we've understood so far as the American era. And I think we are in for some change. I see that change possibly expressed in the way the dynamics of a new nuclear deal would be. The Russians are quite uninterested in pushing for a nuclear deal that would reduce their power over Iran as they provide further munitions and various arms for the war. And I think there is also a sense that the global South is rising, and I think there is opportunity for us to see movement on that. Again, I feel Europe is quite well positioned to take advantage of this in a way that the United States simply can't, because it's on the other side. And the last note, I think it's important. I was just in China not just, it's been about 6 months, but I was there in April. And I get the distinct impression from my stay there that they are interested in finding the gaps in the areas of international relations where the United States will not feel sensitive. So bringing Saudi Arabia and Iran together was an example of that. That was something the United States was not going to do. It didn't step on American toes, but it changed a dynamic. And I see the Chinese definitely holding meetings with the Gazans and with the Palestinians and as a whole, trying to find some common leadership and some common goals, because there has been a deficit in defining what will be the objectives, the people that can lead the Palestinians as a unit. So I see the Chinese playing a greater role, and it could be very positive.
If you are able to say in 1 minute each before they kick us from the stage, I give the floor to all of you, but briefly just to...
Okay, so 2 quick comments. First, about what you said, Emiliano, regarding the support to an elected government. I did not dispute that this government was elected.
Of course.
What I was trying to argue is that this government was elected due to an unfortunate political coincidence in Israel, and that since they were elected, the support that they originally had, even during the elections, declined because of the 7th of October, and this is one of the other reasons they're trying to play the long game, and that we do have some allegations in Israel that are now widely discussed regarding attempts of Netanyahu's team to actively undermine a deal, leaking confidential documents. There are criminal investigations going on because of that, but it just demonstrates further the lack of interest that Netanyahu has in ending the war. And the second thing is regarding the Abraham Accords. So I was surprised by the Abraham Accords originally when they happened because of what is known as the Arab Peace Initiative of 2003. And the main incentive for Israel to actually go for the Arab Peace Initiative was normalization with the Arab world. And the narrative of the right in Israel for the Abraham Accords was peace for peace. So there is a formula known in Israel as the Land for Peace formula because of the Egypt peace agreement where Israel gave up the Sinai Peninsula. And the new narrative was this is peace for peace, but as Abdelkarim said, by avoiding the Palestinian conflict, we actually saw that it undermined peace in some ways.
Professor.
Thank you. I want to echo what Roxane said about China. I also get that impression, and so let's build upon that. So one of my takeaways is that industrial policy is back, and it's not necessarily a bad thing. It's not an unmixed blessing. Let's use it strategically. Let's be adroit. Let's be tactically nimble. And let's form government-business partnerships that are geared toward this enormous region of incredible opportunity. The MENA region it's just breathtaking, the talent there, which the Swiss recognize. I was reading earlier this morning a top-shelf government report. Ignacio Cassis wrote the foreword. I would have liked to have stopped him last night to talk about this. It's a report about Switzerland's engagement of the MENA region, and this is maybe one of those government reports that gets issued. But you know, if you read it, it's actually got a lot of substance, and it reflects a very considered, skillful approach on the part of the Swiss Foreign Ministry to ensure that it's ahead of things relative to engaging this incredibly important region. And I think that's going to be even more important going forward. The report is dated 2021 to 2024. I don't know if a more recent report has been written yet. Probably it's in the works, and I'm keen to read it. Thank you.
Very briefly, I would say that actually my perspective of the Gaza war was that it exposed a lot of cracks in global governance, in international law, in norms and values in the West. But it also exposed cracks, regional cracks, between countries. And I think it's also something that mediators in Switzerland and Europe and beyond should look into. These very dormant conflicts, the ones that no one talks about, they don't make it to the headlines in the past years, but they're still there, and they're entrenched, and they might be exploding any time. And I'm thinking directly, for instance, of the Moroccan-Algerian dispute, how it has been reactivated since the Gaza war started over different periods. So these are the things that also should be taken into consideration when we think about the future of the Mediterranean and MEM region at large.
Thank you so much. Do we have time for one question? I'm asking to. Yes, please. There was somebody. Yeah, thank you so much. Please.
Thank you so much. My name is Maher Akra. Because you had mentioned about Golan, I'm from Syria. So with the evolving geopolitical change in the Middle East, especially after the Abraham Accords, do you think there is a possibility that the Golan or Golan Heights could be fall as a part of Israel? How might this affect Syrian position in the region, given in the ongoing in Gaza and Lebanon? I don't know, it's really difficult, but yeah, maybe. Yeah, thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Professor Farmanfarmaian. Please.
So your question was, is the Golan going to be part of the negotiations going forward? At the moment, I think what we're seeing is that Israel has extended its war across the borders of the Golan and are moving quite strongly into Syria. And in fact, the last week, there's been a great deal of attack by the Israeli forces into Syria. So we're seeing a broadening from Lebanon into Syria. I think it's quite difficult to know. I know that this morning the news was that it's possible that Trump has a daughter whose father-in-law was Lebanese born, and that he's now being tapped as a possible negotiator for peace being brought to Lebanon. And certainly the Golan could be right there, and Syria has been extremely heavily affected by the war in Lebanon, that's for sure, in terms of the numbers of people that have been going back and forth and back. So I think we'd like to see a solution, but I'm not sure it's going to be at the forefront of negotiations. What do you think?
I agree that the Golan Heights, the Israeli public does not see it as on the table in any possible solution regarding the current conflict. The Golan Heights was on the table in the past, and the narrative presented in Israel is that the instability in Syria proves that it is actually a positive thing that the Golan was not given back to Syria, because the Golan Heights has a strategic position overlooking all of the Israeli settlements that are in the Jordan Valley below the Golan Heights. So the question is, as of this moment, this is not the case. The Golan Heights is not on the table. I'm telling you what I'm experiencing in.
Yeah. That was the. No, that's interesting, and of course I think everybody could hear, because even without a microphone, and that's one of the topic, and we are just wrapping up, but there is a coffee, we can keep talking because it's extremely interesting, and we didn't even mention that among these new perspective, the evolving geopolitical configuration, we don't have to forget the hundreds of thousands of civilians that are paying the price while we're sitting here and discussing. I mean, I was at the border with Gaza. As an international journalist, I cannot enter. You feel as a human being that you can see people bombed while you are in Nirod's settlement and burying somebody who was killed in Gaza. So you have a sufferance of families on this side, you have a huge sufferance. The same, I'm not comparing sufferance on the other side. So among all these geopolitical conversations, I think we have to hope that as soon as possible, the civilian population, which has been targeted in at least 13 months, and we don't go back too much with history because we know what's happening in the West Bank and other regions, but in Lebanon as well, where civilians are targeted daily. So I think that most of all, it's so important that any kind of an agreement, which whoever negotiator, I'm kind of, I read the same news, and you know, it's not encouraging thinking that you need the father-in-law of your daughter-in-law to solve it out, because we were talking about diplomacy yesterday here with some experts and some skilled professionals. So we'll see, but at least hopefully that this situation before the next MEM can be different, because in December someone told me, Emiliano, we were driving towards south of Hebron Hills and say, listen, Yehuda Shaul is a well-known Israeli activist, told me, can you imagine the situation continuing up to Trump is back to the White House? It's a fantasy politics. It was December. No one was thinking about having such a war in Gaza, and here we are. U.S. election and the situation that didn't change. So hopefully it will. Coffee time, Federica is reminding me. Thank you very much to our panelists, and see you for the second panel. Thank you.